Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 10 of the most disturbing true marriage stories ever submitted to this channel. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning authentic horror over cheap jump scares. Share your own story in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Let's get into it. I found out my husband had a teenage daughter when she knocked on our front door on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The kind of gray Indiana day where the sky just sits on top of the town like a lid. I was folding laundry. I remember that because I had one of his flannel shirts in my hands when the doorbell rang. And I remember thinking it was probably the UPS guy with the ovulation kits I'd ordered again. Because that's what my life was made of back then. 6 years married to Dale, trying for a baby for 2 of them, and him gone 3 weeks out of every 4 hauling freight across 5 states. I opened the door in my socks and there was a girl standing on the porch, maybe 15, arms crossed against the cold, and she looked at me like she already knew exactly who I was and didn't much care for it. She asked if this was Dale Whitfield's house. I said yes, and asked who was asking. She said, "I'm his daughter. I'm looking for my dad. I want to tell you." I laughed it off right away, told her she had the wrong Dale Whitfield, because that's what I wanted to believe standing there in my socks. But she didn't flinch when I said that. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of a man leaning against a truck cab with a mug of coffee in his hand, wearing the exact CB headset Dale kept clipped to his visor, the one with the cracked earpiece he never replaced, because he said it still worked fine. She knew his CB handle. She knew about the scar on his left forearm from a chain that snapped loose on a flatbed load years back. A stranger doesn't know that. A confused kid with the wrong house doesn't know that. I stood in my own doorway and felt the floor tilt a little, because somewhere in me, underneath the part that wanted to call this a mistake, I already believed her. I let her in. I don't know why, except that it felt worse to leave her on the porch in the cold, while I decided whether her life was real. Her name was Emma. She sat at my kitchen table, the one Dale and I ate breakfast at every morning he was home, and she told me she'd been looking for him for 2 months because he'd gone quiet on her, stopped answering texts, and she'd finally tracked down his address through a cousin's tagged photo on Facebook and one of those people search websites you pay $8 to use. She said she just wanted to know if he was okay. She didn't come there to blow up my life. She came there because she was worried about her father, and it hadn't occurred to her that doing that would blow up mine too. That night, after she left, I did something I'd never done in 6 years of marriage. I logged into the freight company's driver portal using the password he kept saved on our shared laptop, the one he used to check his own settlement pay. I told myself I was just going to look at his current route. What I found was a log going back 3 years, and buried in it, every 5 or 6 weeks, an overnight stop in a town 3 hours south called Percy Falls, Missouri, a town that wasn't on any of his usual delivery routes and had no freight customer listed, just a stop. Same town, over and over, like clockwork, for 3 years running. The next afternoon, while he was still out on a haul to Tennessee, I went looking through the personal truck he kept parked at the house, for when he was between jobs, the one due at the shop that week for an inspection. Underneath the driver's seat, in a magnetic key box zip-tied to the frame, I found a second phone. It wasn't even hidden well. It was just a cheap prepaid flip phone with one contact saved under the letters Ren. Years of texts. Not just check-ins, plans, anniversaries. A text from 4 months back that said, "Can't wait to see you and the kids next week." Plural, kids. And my stomach dropped in a way it hadn't even dropped for Emma. Because up until that second, I still thought this was one daughter from a life before me, a closed chapter he'd never fully let go of. Kids meant this wasn't a chapter, this was a whole other book running alongside mine the entire time. I called the number, I don't know what I expected. Screaming, maybe. Or her hanging up on me. Some other woman's script I'd absorbed from television. What I got instead was a woman named Renee, who went quiet for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that sounded tired rather than triumphant, "I always figured this day would come." She told me Dale had told her he was divorced when they first got back together, that she only learned about me 2 years in, and by then, There was Emma to think about. And later, there was Cody. I asked who Cody was. She said, "Our son. He's 4. And just like that, the story I'd been building in my head, of a man who'd made one mistake before me and never quite closed the door on it, collapsed into something else entirely. This wasn't old history. This was ongoing. This was a child born 2 years into my marriage. Renee didn't sound like a woman gloating over me. She sounded like someone who'd just found out she'd been standing in the exact same water I had, thinking she was the only one on dry land. We were quiet on the phone together for a while. 2 strangers who'd just found out they were living the same life 6 weeks out of sync from each other. And something about that shared quiet made me trust her more than I trusted my own husband. Emma came back to the house 2 more times that week, and the second visit is the one that still sits heaviest with me. She showed me a video from her birthday dinner back in October. Dale standing up with a glass of sweet tea, giving a toast. And it was word for word, not close, word for word, the toast he'd given at our anniversary dinner that same month. Same joke about the day they met. Same line about the best decision I never planned on making. He'd used the same charm bracelet too, the one with a little truck charm and a heart charm, the one he'd given me for our 5th anniversary and told me he'd had custom made just for me. Emma had one just like it, given to her the same month. He wasn't a man drowning in guilt trying to keep 2 people happy. He'd built a template. He ran 2 houses off the same script like it was a route he had memorized, because in a way, it was. Once I understood there was a template, I stopped looking for mistakes he'd made and started looking for what he'd built on purpose. I found a business filing for a small truck maintenance LLC, registered to an address in Percy Falls, opened 4 years ago, funded out of an account I didn't know existed. Money I'd noticed missing over the years and always explained away. Truck repairs, permit fees, the cost of doing business, he'd say, had been going 3 hours south the whole time, building a second household with the same steady hand he used to build ours. Then came the part that undid me more than any of it. I'd been pulling records for a life insurance policy that week, and in with the paperwork was a claim statement from a clinic, dated a little over 3 years back, for a vasectomy. My husband, the same man who sat next to me at 2 different fertility specialists, who let me blame my own body for 2 years, who held my hand in waiting rooms while nurses drew my blood and told me my numbers looked fine and we should just keep trying, had made absolutely sure years earlier that trying with me would never work. The date on that claim was 4 months after Cody was born. He hadn't just chosen another family over building one with me. He'd made a quiet, permanent decision to close that door on me specifically, while keeping it wide open somewhere else. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. Something in me went very still and very clear instead, the way water gets right before it freezes. When Dale texted that Friday to say he'd be pulling into the driveway around 6 that evening, I didn't tell him anything was wrong. I spent that week making calls instead. I called Renee back and asked if she and the kids would come. I called Emma. I set 2 extra places at the kitchen table where Emma had first sat and told me the truth, and I waited. He walked in around 6:15, tired, smelling like the road, already talking about a bad way station backup in Ohio, and stopped in the doorway of his own kitchen when he saw who was sitting at his own table. For a second, his face did something I'd never seen it do before, something close to fear, and then it smoothed right back over into the face he probably used at every way station and every dispatch call and every kitchen table in every state he'd ever slept in. He didn't fall apart. He didn't confess. He started explaining, fast and practiced, telling Renee she was twisting things, telling Emma she didn't understand grown-up situations, telling me he could explain everything if I just let him. It came out smooth, rehearsed, like a man reciting a defense he'd already given before, more than once, to more than one of us. Emma was the one who stopped him cold. She pulled up years of messages on her phone, screenshots going back to when she was 11, every one of them showing him reaching out first, planning the visits first, and laid them on the table without a word. And for the first time all night, he had nothing smooth left to say. Renee told me something else that night, almost as an afterthought, that took the last bit of shock out of the discovery for me. She'd already started the paperwork to list Dale as Cody's legal father for the boys' school enrollment that fall. It wasn't optional anymore on her end. The school required it. She said she knew, filling that paperwork out months ago, that it was only a matter of time before everything came apart on its own, with or without Emma ever knocking on my door. What I'd thought was a stranger's decision to go looking for her father turned out to be one small piece of something already quietly unraveling. A clock that had already started counting down before any of us in that kitchen knew it. I thought that was the last of it. It wasn't. A couple weeks later, after I'd already moved my things into my sister's spare room and filed the paperwork to end the marriage, Dale's old dispatcher, a heavy-set man named Hutch, who used to grill out with us on the 4th of July, called me to say he was sorry for how things turned out. Trying to be kind, he said something that wasn't kind at all. He said Dale had done something like this once before, years before Renee, a woman on a different route in another state, someone Hutch only remembered as Tammy, back before I'd even met him. He said it like a small detail, like it might make me feel less singled out. Instead, it told me the man I'd married hadn't slipped once, and then kept slipping. He'd built this into how he lived, a pattern stretching back further than any of us in that kitchen had guessed. Roots and towns and women, stacked quietly on top of each other for the better part of 15 years. It's been 8 months now. I have my own apartment above a hardware store in town, a job I actually like, and mornings that belong only to me. A few weeks ago, I got a voicemail from a woman in Kentucky I'd never heard of, asking, careful and a little shaky, if I knew a Dale Whitfield, because she thought maybe her son looked like him. I sat with that phone in my hand for a long minute, and I want to tell you it broke something open in me all over again, but it didn't. I felt for her the way Renee and I had felt for each other in that first quiet phone call, 2 women standing in the same water. I called her back and told her what I knew. Then I made coffee, went to work, and let the rest of the day be mine, because for the first time in longer than I can remember, it actually was. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon while I had my hands in dishwater, half listening to a rerun on the kitchen TV. I almost let it go to voicemail because the number wasn't saved. Just a string of digits with a local area code. I picked up anyway, wiping my hand on my jeans, and a woman with a flat customer service voice asked to speak with Mark. I told her he wasn't home, and she said she was calling regarding a personal loan that had gone into collections. Account ending in 4471, and could I confirm his current mailing address for our records? I stood there with soap running down my wrist and told her she had the wrong person. We didn't have any loan like that. She read back a name, our address, and the last 4 of a social security number that I didn't have memorized, but that sounded right enough to make my stomach drop half an inch. I told her I'd have him call back and hung up before she could say anything else, and then I stood in my kitchen telling myself it was a scam, one of those spoofed calls that pulls your name off some data breach and dresses it up to sound official. People get those all the time. I'd gotten one myself 2 years back about a car warranty I didn't own. I almost let it go at that. Almost. But something about the way she'd said his employer's name, not just your husband, but Mark, who works at Ferris Honda, sat wrong with me all afternoon. So before he got home, I called the number back myself, the real one on the bank's website, not the one that had called me. A different rep, same story. A personal loan, originated 8 months earlier, $14,300, 31 days past due. She read me his date of birth. She read me the last 4 of his real social. There was no version of this where it was a stranger's mistake. He walked in around 6:30, smelling like the dealership, cold air and coffee, and kissed the top of my head like he did every night. And I almost couldn't get the words out. When I finally told him about the call, I watched his face for half a second of panic before it smoothed over into something calm and a little annoyed, like I was the one causing a problem. He said it was Kevin's loan. His brother needed a van for the landscaping business, and Mark had co-signed, and Kevin was supposed to be making the payments, and he was clearly behind, and Mark would call him tonight and get it straightened out. It made sense. Kevin had always been the screw-up brother, the one who needed help. I let it go. I actually apologized for jumping to conclusions. 3 weeks later, a different collections agency called about a different account, a personal line of credit for $9,700 that had nothing to do with any van, and I sat in my car in the school pickup line, doing math that didn't work. Kevin's loan was one loan. This was something else. I didn't say anything to Mark that night. I waited until the kids were asleep and told myself I was going to look, quietly, before I said another word out loud. I already had the banking app on my phone from years of splitting the grocery budget, and that night I went further into it than I ever had, past the checking account we both used, and into a linked account I didn't recognize, tied to his email instead of the joint one. The transaction history went back almost 2 years. ATM withdrawals, always cash, always at night, clustered on Tuesdays and Thursdays, at a branch 40 minutes away in a town we had no reason to be in. I looked up the address of that ATM out of pure instinct and found it sitting in the parking lot of a casino I'd only ever seen from the highway, the kind of building with no windows and a sign that glows even at 10 in the morning. I told myself it could still be something else. Maybe he went with coworkers sometimes, played a little blackjack, nothing crazy. Guys did that. But when I pulled up the family iPad the next morning to check Ella's homework app, I noticed a folder on the second screen labeled Tools, the kind of folder nobody actually opens, and inside it was a sports betting app with his login still active. The balance read $0. The transaction history didn't. That was the night I stopped believing him, before he even said anything. I sat him down and told him what I'd found, and this time, there was no smooth story about Kevin, because I had screenshots. He didn't deny the gambling. What he did was smaller, and somehow worse. He told me it wasn't as bad as it looked, that he'd had a rough stretch, that he was already cutting back, that he'd have it paid off before I even noticed the dent in savings. He said it like a man handing me a smaller bill than the one actually due, and some tired, hopeful part of me wanted to take it, because the alternative was too big to hold. I might have let that smaller number be the whole truth if we hadn't started talking to a mortgage broker 2 months later about refinancing the house. The broker ran a joint credit pull to check our rate eligibility, and when the report came back, she got quiet in a way that lenders don't usually get quiet, and asked if we wanted to step into the other room to go over it together. It wasn't $9,700. It wasn't $14,300 plus a van loan, across 6 open accounts. 2 banks, a credit union, a store card at a home improvement chain we'd shopped at maybe twice, and a title loan I hadn't even known existed against his truck. The number came out to just over $80,000. I didn't cry in that office. I remember that specifically, because I expected to and I didn't. I just sat there doing the math on our combined income and realizing how long it would take to climb out of a hole that size. And Mark sat next to me apologizing to the broker like she was the one he owed something to. The title loan was the part that undid me later, at home, alone in the garage after he'd gone to bed. A title loan meant he'd handed over the paperwork to his own truck, the one he drove our kids to school in, to borrow against it. And if there was a title loan I hadn't known about, there could be other things I hadn't found either. So I went out to that truck with a flashlight at 11 at night and started going through it, seat by seat, glove box, door pockets, behind the visor. Wedged down behind the driver's seat, held in place by the seat track itself, I found a manila folder, swollen thick with unopened envelopes. I sat on the cold concrete floor of our garage and went through every one of them by date. Some were recent, some weren't. The oldest envelope in that folder was postmarked almost 5 years back, 6 months before our son was born. I did the math without wanting to. Sam was 7. This hadn't started after some rough patch or some midlife thing. It had been there since before I ever held my son for the first time, quietly running underneath every ordinary year I thought we'd had. A week after that, my sister mentioned something on the phone, half in passing, about a $500 loan she'd given Mark the year before for a car repair, which he'd paid back right on schedule, so she'd never thought twice about bringing it up. She only mentioned it now because we were talking about money in general, and she assumed I already knew. I hadn't. He'd gone around me, into my own family, and borrowed from my sister without either of us ever knowing the other side of it. That was the moment the betrayal stopped feeling like a financial problem and started feeling like something that had quietly rearranged the architecture of every relationship around me without my permission. I packed a bag that weekend. Not dramatically. I didn't leave a note or slam a door. I just folded clothes for myself and the kids into a duffel while they were at their grandmother's, telling myself I needed one night away to think clearly. One night in my sister's guest room, where nobody was hiding anything from me. Mark came home while I was zipping it closed, and for the first time since that first phone call, he didn't manage his face into something calm. He sat down on the edge of our bed and put his hands over his face, and told me things I hadn't even asked about yet. A second title loan attempt that got denied. Money he'd taken from an inheritance his mother had left specifically for the kids' college fund, replacing it a little at a time, and hoping I'd never check the balance against what it should have been. He wasn't confessing to get ahead of anything I already knew. He didn't know what I knew and what I didn't anymore, and it came out anyway, all of it, in a voice that didn't sound like the man who sold cars for a living. I still went to my sister's that night. I needed the distance to think without his voice in the room. But I came back 3 days later, not because I'd forgiven anything, but because I did the arithmetic on what leaving would actually mean. 2 kids, 1 income that had just been proven completely unreliable, a housing market that wasn't kind to a single income with 2 dependents, and a husband who, underneath the addiction, wasn't a man I could point to a single cruel moment with. I wasn't staying because I believed the worst was over. I was staying to see, clear-eyed, whether it actually would be. We separated our finances the following month. My paycheck from the dental office and half of his commissions go into an account only I control, and the mortgage, insurance, and every bill gets paid from there first. What's left of his pay goes into a second account he manages, capped, with the banking app set to send me a text alert on every transaction over $50. He started going to a Gamblers Anonymous meeting twice a week, the same 2 nights, Tuesday and Thursday, which felt like its own quiet, ugly joke, given the pattern I'd found on that first bank statement. I went with him to 2 sessions of financial counseling before deciding I needed my own version of that conversation instead. One where I wasn't managing his shame on top of my own exhaustion. Around tax season, 7 months after the folder in the truck, I found one more thing. A small, forgotten payday loan for $600 he'd taken out before any of this had come apart. One he genuinely seemed to have lost track of himself, buried under a due date that had already passed twice. The old version of me would have felt the floor drop out again. This time I just added it to the spreadsheet I keep now, the one with tabs for every account, every balance, every login, updated every Sunday night after the kids are in bed. And I didn't raise my voice when I told him about it. I didn't need to. We both already knew what $600 more meant in the larger picture, and neither of us pretended it meant nothing. We're still married. The kids still don't know most of it, though Ella's old enough now to notice when money comes up in a different tone than it used to. Mark's 22 months clean from betting, as far as I can verify, which is a phrase I never thought I'd need to qualify like that in my own head. I don't check the accounts because I'm anxious anymore. I check them because it's simply what I do now, the way some people check the weather before they leave the house. I'm not the woman who believed the story about his brother's van without blinking. I don't think I'll ever fully be her again, and some days, I miss how easy that trust used to make things. But I sleep better, knowing exactly where every dollar is, than I ever did back when I thought I already knew. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that I was married for 4 years to a man I loved completely, and I still don't know his real name. We met the normal way, through mutual friends at a barbecue, and we did the normal things. Dated for a year, got engaged on a trip to the coast, married in a small ceremony with maybe 40 people. He worked in something he called regional operations for a mid-sized logistics company. The kind of job that sounded specific enough to be believable and vague enough that nobody ever asked follow-up questions. We moved 3 times in 4 years. Ohio, then Tennessee, then a small city in North Carolina. Each time it was, The company wants me closer to the new distribution hub, and each time I packed our life into boxes and didn't think much of it, because that's what marriage is sometimes. You bend around the shape of the other person's life. We didn't have kids yet. We kept to ourselves in every place we lived, which I used to think was because we were both a little introverted, a little tired from moving so often, to bother building deep friendships we'd just have to leave behind. Looking back now, I think I mistook isolation for intimacy. I thought it was the two of us against the world. It was actually just the two of us, and only one of us knew why. The first crack showed up on a Friday night in March, almost exactly a year ago. My college roommate, Priya, was driving through North Carolina for work and asked if she could crash with us for the weekend. I hadn't seen her in 3 years. She'd met my husband exactly once before, at our wedding, for maybe 20 minutes total, so I wasn't expecting much beyond polite small talk over dinner. She walked in, dropped her bag by the door, looked at him standing in the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and said, "Oh my God, Danny? Danny Ferris?" He didn't answer right away. I remember that pause more than almost anything else that happened afterward, because it wasn't a confused pause. It was a held breath pause. His hand stopped moving on the towel. For maybe 2 full seconds, his face did something I'd never seen it do in 4 years of marriage. Something between recognition and calculation. Then he laughed, easy and warm, and said, "Wrong guy. I get that a lot. Must have one of those faces." Priya laughed too, apologized, said he really did look like someone she went to high school with. Dinner went fine. Wine, catching up, the usual. I would have let it go completely if she hadn't found me alone in the kitchen later that night while he was in the shower. "That was so weird," she said, keeping her voice low. "I know I said it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. That's not a face you get wrong. Danny Ferris was in 3 of my classes senior year. I dated his roommate. It's not just similar, it's the same person. Down to the little scar by his eyebrow." She caught herself, laughed a little, waved it off as jet lag and wine. But she didn't sound like someone who believed her own excuse, and neither did I. I asked her, carefully, over coffee the next morning, what happened to this Danny Ferris? She got quiet in a way that told me she'd been thinking about it all night too. She said he'd left school abruptly halfway through senior year, no explanation, and that later there'd been talk, nothing confirmed. Just the kind of rumor that follows someone who disappears without warning. Something about money that didn't belong to him, and people who came around campus asking questions after he was already gone. She said she hadn't thought about him in years until she watched my husband's face do that thing in the kitchen. I told myself it was a coincidence for exactly 9 days. I know because I counted. Later, once counting things became something I did. During those 9 days, I started noticing things I'd apparently trained myself not to notice. My husband had no photos of himself before the age of about 25. Not one childhood picture, not one school photo, nothing on any shelf or in any album. When I'd asked about it early in our relationship, he'd told me his parents died in a car accident when he was in his 20s, and he wasn't close with the rest of his family. And I'd accepted that the way you accept a wound you don't want to reopen for someone you love. He never mentioned his hometown by name. Whenever the topic came close, he'd redirect, smoothly, the way you'd correct a wheel that's drifting on the highway. Small adjustments, so you never notice you're being steered. I called Priya again about 2 weeks later and asked her, straight out, if she could find out anything more about what happened to the real Danny Ferris. She dug up an old friend from their hometown, someone who still lived there, and what came back wasn't a lot, but it was enough to sit wrong in my stomach for days. The friend remembered him as quiet, likable, someone who worked at a car dealership and vanished the same month. A large amount of a customer's trade-in money went missing from the books. No charges, no arrest that anyone could find. Just a person who was there 1 week and gone the next, and a family that stopped talking about him. I didn't say any of this to my husband. I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? My old roommate thinks you might be a guy who vanished after some money went missing. 11 years ago. It sounded insane out loud, even in my own head. Then, almost like he could feel me circling something, he came home from work on a Tuesday and told me the company wanted him in Georgia. Immediately. Within 3 weeks. This would be our 4th move. When I asked why the rush, why so sudden this time when the other moves had at least a couple months of lead time, he got short with me in a way he never had before. Said sometimes business doesn't wait for anyone's convenience. Said he thought I'd be more supportive. I remember standing in our kitchen thinking, not for the first time, that the timing felt less like a job requirement and more like a man trying to get his wife somewhere new before she finished putting something together. I told him I needed a little time to get things in order before the move, and while he was at work, I did something I'm not proud of and have never regretted. I went through his desk. I found it in the bottom drawer, under a stack of old tax documents, a small metal lockbox with a key I didn't recognize, taped to the underside of the drawer above it. Inside was a manila envelope, and inside that was a laminated ID card, the kind some states issue that aren't quite driver's licenses, along with a folded birth certificate. Neither one said Eric. Neither one said Danny Ferris either. The name on both documents was Wyatt Colson Doyle, with a birth date that put him 4 years older than the age I'd always known him to be. I sat on our bedroom floor holding a stranger's paperwork with my husband's face on it, and felt something in my chest go completely quiet, the way a room goes quiet right after something breaks. I put everything back exactly where I found it and didn't say a word. I told myself I needed proof, real proof, before I said anything that couldn't be unsaid, so I watched him differently after that. I watched the way he checked the rearview mirror 1 beat too long at intersections. I watched how he always paid cash for anything that wasn't a bill in both our names. The gas station happened 9 days before we were supposed to move to Georgia. We'd stopped on a Sunday afternoon to fill up before a drive, and a man in his 50s, wearing a work uniform from a plumbing company, walked over from the next pump, with a look on his face like he'd seen a ghost he was happy about. "Wyatt? Wyatt Doyle? I don't believe it, man. Where the hell have you been? Your uncle still asks about you every time I see him." My husband's whole body went rigid. Not scared exactly, more like a man doing math very fast behind his eyes. He said, flat, that the man had the wrong person, said it twice, and then he was pulling me by the arm back toward the car, before I'd even finished processing what I'd heard. The stranger stood there by the pump looking confused and a little hurt, calling after us that he knew that walk anywhere, that nobody forgets a friend from Bakersfield. In the car, I asked him who Wyatt Doyle was. He told me the man was clearly having some kind of episode, mistaking him for somebody else. People did it constantly. He had one of those faces. I said nothing else the rest of the drive, because I already had the ID with that exact name sitting in a photo on my phone, taken with shaking hands in our bedroom 2 weeks earlier. And for the first time in our marriage, I understood that my husband could lie to me smoothly, completely, without so much as a change in his breathing. That night I didn't sleep. I lay next to a man whose real name I no longer knew for certain, and I started, quietly, methodically, to actually look for the truth instead of waiting for it to fall into my lap. I pulled our marriage license first. His name on it was Eric Michael Colson, matching the ID he'd used to marry me, a social security number I'd seen 100 times on tax forms without ever really looking at it. I ran a basic background search using that number, one of those cheap public record sites, mostly out of desperation more than expectation of finding anything. What came back nearly made me sick. That social security number belonged, according to the record, to a child born in Ohio in the same decade my husband claimed to be born, a child who had died at age 6 from complications after a car accident, more than 30 years ago. The number hadn't been used again publicly until a driver's license was issued under it 11 years back, in a different state entirely. I understood, sitting alone at our kitchen table at 2 in the morning, that I was not looking at a man with a colorful past, or a few white lies about his family. I was looking at someone who had built himself out of pieces, using a dead child's number as the foundation, layering names on top of names, moving every time a life started to have edges sharp enough to cut him. I found the storage unit key almost by accident, tucked in the lining of an old jacket he never wore anymore, with a paper receipt from a facility 20 minutes outside our town, a unit he'd been renting under yet a different name for over 3 years, paid in cash, always in cash. I went while he was at work, Told the front desk I was there to grab something for my husband, and they let me in without much of a look at all. There were 4 boxes. I opened every one of them. There were wallets, plural, each with a driver's license or state ID inside. Each a slightly different man with the same face, a different haircut sometimes, a different weight, but the same eyes every time. Eric Colson, Wyatt Doyle, a Marcus Reyes I'd never heard mentioned once, a Daniel Ferris, the Danny Priya had recognized, whose face in that photo looked younger, softer, a boy who hadn't figured out yet what he'd need to become. There were photographs too, loose ones, mixed in with old receipts and a couple of expired passports from different states. In some of them he had his arm around women I didn't recognize. One photo showing a plain gold band on his hand that wasn't the ring I'd put there myself 4 years earlier. There was nothing that connected any of it into one life. No thread I could pull that led anywhere solid. Just fragments of men who all wore my husband's face, and none of whom, as far as I could tell, had ever really existed past the moment he needed them to. I didn't cry in that storage unit. I remember being surprised by that later. How calm I felt closing the last box. Like something in me had already made a decision my heart hadn't caught up to yet. I confronted him that night, and I want to be honest that I expected anger, or panic, or at the very least, some kind of explanation, even a bad one. What I got instead was worse. He sat down across from me at the table, looked at the photos I'd laid out, and didn't deny a single one of them. He didn't raise his voice. He said, very quietly, that I already had everything I needed to make my decision, and that whatever I chose to do next, I should do it fast and not look back, and that some things were better left alone for my own good. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was worse than a threat, because it sounded like the truest thing he'd ever said to me, and it told me that whatever was underneath all of this went somewhere I genuinely did not want to follow. I left that night. I didn't pack much, just what fit in one bag and the folder of documents and photographs I'd taken from the storage unit as proof that any of this had actually happened, because some nights since then, I've needed to look at them just to remember I didn't imagine it. I stayed with my sister for 2 months while I figured out how to legally end a marriage to a man whose real name I couldn't put on a single form, because even Eric Colson, it turned out, when my lawyer tried to trace him formally, led back to records that dead-ended, in ways that made her go quiet on the phone, the same way I had in that storage unit. I moved on, or something close to it. Got my own place. Small, in a town none of this ever touched. For a while I let myself believe the story was finished, ugly and unfinished as it was, but at least it was behind me. Then, about 7 months after I left, I got a phone call from a woman I'd never spoken to before. She said her name was Renata, and she said she'd found my number written on the back of an old photograph she'd come across while going through her husband's things after he'd disappeared on her 3 weeks earlier, mid-move to a new city. No warning, no explanation. She described him to me in detail I didn't need, because I already knew. Different name than any of the ones I had, same eyes. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, comparing what little we each had, and by the end of it, neither of us was any closer to a real answer than when we started. We still don't know his actual name. We don't know how many of us there have been, or how many more there might be right now, somewhere, calling him something we've never heard, believing, the way I once did, that they know exactly who they married. A lawyer called, asking about my husband's parole. That's the line I keep coming back to, because that's really how the whole thing started. On a Tuesday afternoon that felt like every other Tuesday I'd had in 8 years of marriage. Laundry was going. Sauce was on the stove. My youngest was napping and the older 2 were fighting over a tablet in the next room, and my phone buzzed on the counter with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish now that I had. The man on the line was calm and businesslike. The kind of voice you associate with insurance companies or debt collectors. Not danger. He said he was calling to confirm a home address on file for a man named Cole, my husband, for parole compliance purposes. I laughed, actually laughed, and told him he had the wrong number, that my husband worked construction, and had never so much as gotten a speeding ticket in the years I'd known him. The man didn't laugh back. He read off Cole's full name, his date of birth, and the address of the house I was standing in at that exact moment, and asked again if this was correct. I told him to hold on, and I remember my hand was actually shaking a little, not because I believed him yet, but because something about the specificity of it had gotten under my skin. He said if this wasn't a good time, he'd try the cell number listed in the file instead, and before I could ask him a single real question, he thanked me for my time and hung up. He'd rattled off a case number fast, the way people do when they're reading it off a screen and moving to the next call on their list, and out of nothing but old habit from years of answering phones at the front desk of my kid's school, I grabbed a pen and wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt, without even thinking about why. I told myself it was nothing. Identity mix-ups happen, I said. People share names, and somewhere out there was probably another Cole, with our exact same last name, having a very confusing day of his own. But I didn't throw that receipt away, and that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and typed that case number into the county court records site, the same site I'd once used to look up a neighbor's property taxes out of pure nosiness. I told myself I was doing it just to rule it out completely, so I could stop thinking about it and go back to bed. It didn't rule anything out. It pulled up a real case, a real file, with his real name and our county listed as the jurisdiction, filed a little over 12 years earlier, back when he would have been 24. I sat there clicking through pages that wouldn't fully load, my stomach dropping a little further, with every scanned document that stamped his name, next to words like defendant and sentencing. The charge was aggravated domestic assault, not a bar fight, not a DUI, not the vague, some trouble he'd always waved off with a half smile when anyone asked about his younger years. There was a woman's name in the file too, not mine, someone from before we'd ever met, and a note about injuries that had required hospitalization. He'd served almost 3 years. I read that sentence 4 times before it actually landed, before the version of the man asleep upstairs and the version of the man in that file managed to become the same person in my head. Once they did, everything else started rearranging itself, like a photo I'd looked at 1,000 times, suddenly showing a shape I'd never noticed hiding in the background. I thought about how he'd never once wanted to fly anywhere, always blamed it on hating airports, and how he went quiet and stiff any time a police cruiser pulled up behind us at a red light. I thought about the faded tattoo on his forearm he said was just bad art from a bad phase, the one he'd started keeping covered with long sleeves even in summer a couple of years back, for no reason he ever explained. I thought about an old friend named Rennie who used to call the house sometimes, and how Cole would take those calls outside, and how if I ever answered first, Rennie would go quiet and just ask for him and hang up fast. None of it had seemed like anything at the time. All of it seemed like everything now. I didn't confront him that night. I waited until the kids were down the next evening, sat across from him at the same table where I'd read his court file, and asked him straight out if he had ever been to prison. I'd braced myself for him to get defensive, to deny it, to ask where on earth I'd gotten an idea like that. Instead, he just looked at me for a second, nodded once, and said, "Yeah, that's true," in the same tone he'd used to confirm we were out of milk. No stammering, no color draining from his face, nothing that looked like a man caught. If anything, he looked almost relieved, like he'd been holding a heavy box for years, and someone had finally offered to take it off his hands. Once he started talking, it got worse in a quieter way. He told me rough but boring wasn't something he'd come up with on the spot for me specifically. It was a line he'd built years before we even met, something he'd rehearsed and reused on anyone who ever asked about that stretch of his life, refined over time until it came out smooth and closed the subject every single time. It wasn't a slip of omission I was dealing with. It was a finished product, a story he'd built on purpose to survive exactly this kind of question. And he'd used it on me the same way he'd used it on coworkers and old friends, and probably his own mother. I asked him why a parole officer would still be calling to confirm his address after 12 years, And that's when he told me the part that really knocked the wind out of me, delivered just as flatly as everything else. He said he wasn't fully off paper, that a probation violation years back had tacked on an extended supervision period, and that officers still did periodic checks, sometimes unannounced. He said it like it was a minor bureaucratic detail, a DMV renewal, not something that meant strangers with case files had been quietly keeping tabs on our home the entire time we'd been building a life in it. That detail cracked something open in my memory I hadn't thought about in years. A man had come to the door once, maybe 4 years back, while Cole was at work, asking oddly specific questions about how long we'd lived there and whether Cole was around most evenings. I'd assumed he was some kind of inspector or salesman and mentioned it to Cole in passing that night, and he'd brushed it off so easily I'd forgotten about it within a week. Standing in my kitchen now, I understood exactly who that man had probably been, and it turned my stomach to realize my kids had been playing in the next room, while someone checked to see if their father was behaving. I couldn't leave it there. Over the next few days, in stolen minutes while the kids were at school, I went looking for anything else I could find, and eventually landed on a woman who'd known the victim from that old case, willing to talk in vague, careful terms. What she told me was that it hadn't been one bad night that got wildly out of hand. There'd been a pattern before it, another relationship with a protective order attached to it that never made it to trial. Warning signs people around him had noticed and excused for years before one of them finally landed him in a courtroom. That word, pattern, sat in my chest for days, and it dragged something forward I'd buried without meaning to. Months earlier, during a screaming tantrum from our middle son over nothing, Cole had grabbed his arm hard enough to leave 4 faint marks that lasted into the next morning. I remembered feeling a flicker of unease at the time, and then talking myself out of it, telling myself every exhausted parent loses their grip sometimes, that it wasn't the same as hitting, that I was overreacting. Set next to everything else I now knew, that flicker didn't feel like overreacting anymore. It felt like the first warning I'd already been given and quietly ignored. The last thing I asked him, the night before I packed the kids' bags, wasn't about the assault or the supervision or the visits I hadn't known about. I asked if he had ever planned on telling me, at any point, in 8 years of marriage and 3 kids, before some stranger's phone call forced his hand. He shrugged and said, "I mean, you never asked." Not sorry, not defensive, just a shrug. Like the entire weight of what he'd let me build a family inside of came down to a technicality about who'd phrased which question first. I didn't scream at him. I didn't cry in front of him, though I did plenty of that later in the car once the kids were buckled in and the radio was on loud enough to cover it. I packed 3 bags that night while he sat in the living room saying almost nothing, and I told him exactly why I was leaving. Plainly, without hedging. Not because a 24-year-old made a terrible mistake before I ever met him, but because a 40-year-old sat across from me for a decade and let me believe I knew who he was, while our kids grew up in a house he knew wasn't the full story. I wasn't interested in his explanations for why silence had felt easier for him. I was only interested in getting my kids somewhere safe while I figured out what came next. I don't regret it, and I don't soften it when people ask me about it now. I loved him, or I loved who I thought he was, and some nights that still aches in a way I can't fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. But I've stopped apologizing for how fast I moved once I knew, and I've stopped wondering if I overreacted. A man can change in 12 years. What he can't do is convince me he had any intention of letting me see the difference for myself before it was too late to matter. I left because I had 3 kids upstairs who deserved a mother paying closer attention than I had been, and because the version of loyalty that keeps you quiet in a house like that was never loyalty I was willing to give back. My phone rang at 11:42 on a Tuesday night. The area code was Pittsburgh. Not a number I had saved, but that was normal enough. Daniel's job had him bouncing between our house in Columbus and a satellite office out east, 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there, for as long as I'd known him. So I picked up without thinking twice, expecting maybe a coworker of his or a hotel front desk, asking about a missed checkout. It was a nurse. She said there'd been an accident on Route 76. A jackknife truck, black ice, multiple vehicles involved. She said Daniel was stable, but being kept for observation and possible surgery. I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter and saying, Okay, I'm his wife. I'll come now. Tell me which hospital." And she paused just a beat too long before she answered. She said, "We actually already have a wife listed for him, ma'am. A Mrs. Marsh. She's on her way in now." I told her that was me. She said, "No, this is a different woman. She's already checked in downstairs." I stood in my kitchen for a full minute after we hung up, running through every reasonable explanation I could think of, because reasonable explanations were the only thing keeping my hands steady. Daniel had been married once before, briefly, in his 20s, long before me. He'd mentioned it maybe 3 times in 5 years, always in the same flat tone people use for things that don't matter anymore. I decided the hospital had pulled up an old form, some outdated emergency contact card from a decade ago that nobody had bothered to update. I decided that on the drive, and I kept deciding it for 2.5 hours down 71 and then 76, both hands on the wheel, coffee going cold in the cup holder, because it was easier than the alternative. The waiting room smelled like hand sanitizer and burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights doing that thing where they hum, just below the range of noticing until you notice. There was a woman sitting near the vending machines, maybe 40, a cardigan pulled tight around her, holding a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. She was the only person crying, so I went and sat 2 chairs down and asked if she was there for someone too. She looked at me like I'd asked something absurd and said, "My husband, they said it's bad. He was supposed to be in Columbus this week for work. I don't even know why he was on that stretch of highway." My stomach did something I can't fully describe. Columbus was where I lived. Columbus was where Daniel supposedly came home to every other week. A nurse pushed through the double doors with a clipboard and called out, "Mrs. Marsh?" We both stood up at the same time. There's a specific kind of silence that happens when 2 people realize they're standing in the same spot for the same reason, and neither of them is wrong. She asked how I knew Daniel, and I said he's my husband, and watched her face do the same slow collapse mine must have been doing. We started trading details like we were comparing notes for a test neither of us studied for, except every answer matched. She described his ring, plain brushed titanium, the one he said he picked because he hated how gold felt on his hands at work. Mine was identical. She'd married him at a courthouse in Pittsburgh. I'd married him at a courthouse in Columbus. Neither of us had ever met a single relative of his beyond an uncle he said lived out of state. A hospital security officer came out with a clear plastic bag of Daniel's personal effects, needing a signature from next of kin before they could log it. And since neither of us knew which of us that legally was, he just set it on the chair between us. His phone was in there, cracked screen still glowing faintly from the impact. It lit up once more with a low battery notification, and the lock screen photo staring back was the other woman, smiling in front of a house I didn't recognize. I took out my own phone without saying anything and turned it around. His lock screen on mine was a photo of us at our wedding. We sat there, holding our phones out, like 2 people showing each other winning lottery tickets that had somehow both come up the same losing numbers. It was her idea, not mine, to check the dates. Daniel's phone had a folder of scanned documents, the kind people keep for taxes or insurance, and in it was a PDF titled Marriage License, Allegheny County, dated 7 years back. I pulled up the photo I had of my own certificate on my phone, filed away from our wedding day. Mine was dated 5 years back. She had married him 2 years before I had. I sat with that fact, the way you sit with a diagnosis, waiting for it to rearrange itself into something less permanent, and it never did. If his marriage to her was still valid when he stood across from me in a courthouse and signed his name, then legally, whatever I thought I had for 5 years might never have existed at all. While we were sitting there, stunned and half not speaking, his phone buzzed again, a banking alert this time, visible right there on the cracked screen. "A mortgage payment, auto pay, an address on Baldwin Street," she said quietly. "That's our house." I thought about the business reserve account Daniel managed, the one he said covered slow months and equipment costs, the one I'd deposited part of my inheritance into 3 years ago, when he said cash flow was tight. I didn't say anything about that out loud yet. I was still doing the math in my head, and the math wasn't finishing. A doctor came out sometime after 1 in the morning, still in scrubs, tired in that particular way that isn't about the hour. He said Daniel had a serious head injury, swelling they needed to manage, and they were keeping him sedated, possibly for days, before they'd know anything about lasting damage, or when, or if, he'd be able to speak with anyone at all. Both of us sat with that. Whatever answers existed weren't coming from him, not that night, maybe not for a long time. We were going to have to build the truth out of a phone, a wallet, and each other. Somewhere around 2, in the specific numbness that sets in after enough shocks in a row, she told me about her kids. 2 of them, 7 and 4, staying at her sister's for the night. She said Daniel coached the older one's soccer team every other Saturday when he was home. I had spent 3 years asking Daniel when we could start trying, and every time he said the travel made it impossible right now, that it wouldn't be fair to a kid to have a father gone half the month, that we should wait until things settled down at work. I realized, sitting in that chair, that things had already settled down enough for him to make it to soccer practice. Around 4, a police officer came through asking questions about the crash, standard procedure for anything involving injuries this severe, and mentioned almost in passing that they'd recovered a second bag from the wreck, personal items thrown from the truck bed, and did either of us want to claim them since we were listed as family. Inside was a second phone, a prepaid one, cheap, the kind you buy off a rack at a gas station. It wasn't locked. There were messages saved under a single letter, K, dated over the past 4 months. Arrangements for a hotel in Columbus, my city, on nights I remembered clearly, because I remembered Daniel telling me he'd gotten in late from Pittsburgh those same evenings. Neither of us said much after that. What was there to say that wouldn't just be the same sentence again in a different order? The officer told us that bigamy is a felony in both states, that a report would be filed, that they'd likely need statements from both of us in the coming days. I gave mine a card with a number for a family attorney I hadn't even called yet, wrote her cell number down on the back of a hospital intake form, because neither of us had anything else on us to write on. We didn't hug. We didn't cry together. Exactly. Though we'd both been crying separately for hours by then. We just sat there a while longer, 2 strangers who'd been married to the same man, without either of us doing a single thing wrong. I'm writing this from my car in the parking garage. 3 days later, engine running for the heat, waiting to hear if he's woken up yet. My attorney filed the paperwork for an annulment yesterday morning, on the grounds that the marriage was never legally valid to begin with, and I still don't fully know what that makes the last 5 years of my life. I don't know who Kay is, or if there's a third house somewhere with a third woman waiting on a phone call she doesn't know is coming. I don't know if Daniel will wake up able to explain any of it, or if he'll wake up at all. I only know that somewhere in Pittsburgh, a woman I'd never met is doing the exact same thing I'm doing right now, staring at her phone, waiting for a version of the truth neither of us has gotten to yet. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 7:14 in the morning, face up, right next to the coffee maker, and I glanced at it out of habit, because that's what you do after 3 years of marriage. You just look. You don't even think about it. The screen lit up with a name that wasn't mine and a message that said, "Good morning, baby." And under it was his face. His actual face. The photo from our trip to Charleston. The one where he's got that stupid grin and the wind is messing up his hair. The one I picked because I liked it so much I made it his contact photo in my own phone. Except this wasn't my phone, and this wasn't a contact photo. It was a profile picture on some app I didn't recognize, attached to a name I'd never heard in my life. My first thought, and I mean this honestly, wasn't that he was cheating. My first thought was that someone had stolen his pictures. It happens. You hear about it all the time. Some stranger scrapes your photos off Instagram and slaps them on a fake profile and starts sweet-talking lonely people for money or attention or whatever. I actually felt bad for him for about 90 seconds. I remember thinking, oh no, some creep is out there pretending to be my husband, and he's going to be so annoyed when I show him. I even started composing the conversation in my head, The one where I say, "Babe, you will not believe this. Someone's using your face." So I picked up the phone to get a screenshot for him. Proof, evidence, something to laugh about over breakfast. And it wasn't locked. 3 years married and I know his passcode anyway. But it didn't matter, because it was just sitting there, open, unlocked, like it had nothing to hide. Which should have been my first real warning, because things that have nothing to hide don't usually get left open on a kitchen counter at 7 in the morning, while the other person is in the shower, thinking they're safe. I tapped into the message and it wasn't a browser tab showing someone else's profile. It was the app itself, logged in, active, his. Not a screenshot of a catfish account. The actual account, running on his phone, sending from his phone, and the "Good morning baby" I'd seen, wasn't sent to him. It was sent by him. That was the moment my stomach did the thing where it drops and keeps dropping, past the floor, past the foundation of the house, because I understood in about 2 seconds flat that I wasn't looking at him being impersonated. I was looking at him doing the impersonating. I told myself, okay, one conversation, one weird, lonely mistake. People do dumb things. Maybe it's new. Maybe it's a one-time thing he got pulled into and didn't know how to get out of. So I scrolled up, and I kept scrolling, and there wasn't just the one woman. There were others, different names in the same thread list, different pet names for each of them. Sweetheart for one, gorgeous for another, baby for the one who'd texted that morning, like he had a rotation and a rhythm to it, like he'd been doing this long enough to know which flattery went with which name, so he wouldn't slip up. Then I saw the money. Not a lot at first glance. 20 here, 40 there, sent through an app with little cartoon icons and cheerful colors. Notes attached that said things like, "For you," or "Treat yourself," or "Just because." And I realized this wasn't only about attention. Somewhere along the way it had become a hustle. My husband, the man who complained about splitting an Uber, had built himself a whole second income off women who thought they were falling for a real person. And he had built a person. That was the part that really got me, once I settled into reading, instead of just scrolling in shock. This wasn't him panic typing whatever came to mind. There was a job in there. Some story about working in construction management, a city that wasn't ours. A whole little biography. He'd clearly rehearsed enough times that he never contradicted himself. At least not that I could find in an hour of frantic scrolling with my thumb shaking. You don't build something that consistent by accident. You build it on purpose. And you maintain it, the way you'd maintain anything you actually cared about. I checked the date on the earliest message I could find, because at that point I needed a timeline. I needed to know how long I'd been living next to this without noticing. And the account was over a year old. A year, which on its own was enough to make me sit down on the kitchen floor with his phone in my lap. But then my brain, which apparently hates me, did the math out loud before I could stop it. A year ago, put this before our wedding, not after, before. I had been picking out flowers, and he had been telling some woman named on his phone as sweetheart that he couldn't stop thinking about her. I kept scrolling anyway, because at that point, I was past hurt and heading somewhere colder, somewhere that just wanted the full picture, no matter what it cost me. And it got worse. The account didn't start around the wedding. It started before the engagement too, which meant that when he got down on one knee in my parents' backyard with my grandmother's ring, this whole other life was already running underneath ours, already had months on the clock. He proposed to me while he was already someone else on the side. Then I found a message, one specific one, time-stamped from a week that I recognized instantly because it's carved into me. The week I lost the pregnancy, the week I could barely get out of bed, and he was so good to me, brought me soup, held me while I cried, told everyone how strong I was being. That same week, on that same phone, he was telling some stranger he wished he could just start over with someone who understood him. I read that line maybe 6 times. I wanted it to say something else. It didn't change no matter how many times I looked at it. And then I saw my own name, not flattering. He'd told at least 2 of them that his wife didn't get him, that things at home were cold, that he felt trapped, that he was thinking about leaving. He was using my marriage, our actual real life, as the sob story to make himself sympathetic to women he was trying to get money and attention from. I wasn't just being cheated on, I was being used as a prop in the fiction. The last thing, the thing that finally cracked something open in my chest that hadn't cracked yet, was a name in that contact list I recognized. Not a stranger. Someone from my own life. A woman I'd met at a work event years back. Someone I was still sort of friendly with online. She'd been talking to him too, under his fake name, with no idea that the man complimenting her was married to someone she knew. That's the part that still gets me. It wasn't some far-off stranger's problem. It reached into my actual circle, and he didn't even flinch about the risk. He came out of the shower still toweling off his hair, and I didn't yell, which honestly surprised me more than it surprised him. I just held the phone up and said one name, the sweetheart one, and watched his face do about 4 different things in under 2 seconds. First, nothing, like his brain hadn't caught up. Then the denial, fast and practiced. That's not what it looks like. Then, when I didn't even respond to that, he skipped straight past guilt into this eerily calm explanation about how it wasn't real cheating because there was never anyone in person. It was just talking. It was just a character. It didn't mean anything. And when that didn't move me either, he pivoted again, quick as anything, into how things had been hard between us. How I'd been distant, like somehow this was a conversation we'd already had in his head 100 times before. Like he'd built the defense right alongside the lie, ready to deploy the second he got caught. That's what told me everything, honestly. Not the messages, not the money, not even the timeline. It was how smooth the excuse came out, like a script he'd rehearsed for a moment he always knew was coming. A man doesn't build that kind of explanation for something he thinks he'll never get caught doing. Some part of him had been expecting this day since before he ever put a ring on my finger. I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything, I just told him to pack a bag, and when he tried to keep talking, I told him he could finish the sentence to someone named Sweetheart because I was done being his audience. He was out of the house by 10 that night, duffel bag over one shoulder, still trying to explain something to me on the porch while I stood in the doorway with my arms crossed. And I remember feeling less like my life was falling apart, and more like I'd finally been handed the last piece of a puzzle I didn't know I'd been building for a year. So now when people ask how the marriage ended, I just tell them the truth. He got caught wishing his wife a good morning under someone else's name, and it turned out that lie was older than the marriage itself. Not exactly the wedding vow I remember signing up for, but hey, at least I got a clean exit and a genuinely excellent story out of it. It was a Tuesday night, bath time, and Lily was splashing water over the side of the tub in that careless way 4-year-olds have, like the floor wasn't going to need mopping later, when she said it as easy as telling me what she'd had for lunch. She said Daddy has a special medicine that makes him sleepy at work, and that one of the nurses gives it to him in the back room so the doctors don't see. I laughed. I actually laughed, because it sounded like some cartoon logic, a half-heard hospital conversation scrambled through a 4-year-old's imagination. I toweled her hair, told her that was silly, and she asked for 2 stories instead of 1, and that was that. Except it wasn't, because the sentence sat in me the rest of that night, like a splinter I could feel but couldn't find. Mark had been an ER nurse for 12 years, the last 4 as charge nurse on nights, the guy the new hires called when a patient was crashing and nobody knew what to do first. 10 years married, a mortgage in a neighborhood with good schools, 2 kids, a golden retriever we never had time to train properly. He was the reliable one. My mother used to say I'd married the only nurse in America who still remembered anniversaries. So when I started noticing things, I did what anyone does when the person across from you has spent a decade being the person you trust most. I built explanations for him before he even had to ask. He'd been falling asleep at the dinner table, fork still in his hand, for probably 4 months by then. I told myself it was the shift work. He'd lost maybe 15 pounds, and I told myself it was the gym bag I saw him carrying out to the garage most nights. The one he said was for the new workout routine he'd started to deal with stress. He'd started taking longer showers, disappearing into the bathroom for 20 minutes at a stretch, and I told myself a grown man was allowed 20 minutes to himself. Every single piece of it had a reasonable story attached. Because I was the one attaching the stories, and I was good at it. Because I loved him, and because the alternative was something I didn't want to look at directly. Lily's comment didn't hand me new information. It handed me the thing I'd been doing wrong for months, which was refusing to add up numbers I'd already been given. 2 days later, I was moving his coat off the back of a kitchen chair to hang it up, and a pill bottle rolled out of the inside pocket onto the floor. I picked it up assuming it was aspirin, the everyday kind of thing that lives in a man's coat pocket. It wasn't aspirin, it was oxycodone, 30 milligrams, and the name on the label wasn't his. It was a name I didn't recognize, some patient I'd never heard of, filled at a pharmacy across town we'd never used. I stood there in my kitchen holding a stranger's prescription in my husband's coat, and felt something shift under my feet that I can only describe as the floor, deciding it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I did something I'm not proud of, and also don't regret, which is that I went looking. I found a second phone charging behind the winter coats in the hall closet, a cheap, prepaid thing I'd never seen him use. The texts on it weren't romantic, which some small, tired part of me had almost braced for, because that, at least, would have made sense to me. They were about supply, about a coworker named Denny who could get him extras from waste, about doses that were supposed to be documented as discarded that weren't, about timing pickups around shift changes so nobody would notice the count was off. I sat on the closet floor with my knees pulled up and understood, in the flat, clean way you understand something true, that this wasn't a man occasionally borrowing a pill to get through a bad week. This was a system he'd built, and systems don't get built in a few months. When I finally brought it to him, 2 nights later, I laid the pill bottle on the counter between us, like evidence in a trial I hadn't meant to be arguing. He didn't panic. That was almost the worst part. He picked it up, turned it over once, and gave me an explanation, so calm and so clinical that for about 90 seconds, I actually felt myself softening. Something about a patient's leftover discharge medication that gets returned to staff for proper disposal, about how sometimes it sits in a coat pocket for weeks before anyone remembers to log it, about hospital protocols I wouldn't know because I wasn't the one who worked there. He used words like diversion protocol and chain of custody, the way other men use "I swear on my kids." And for a moment, his competence, the very thing that had made me trust him for a decade, was being used to make me doubt what was directly in my own hand. I remember going to bed that night less sure than I'd been before I found the bottle, and lying awake furious at myself for that. It was a friend from nursing school, a woman named Renata who still worked 2 floors up from Mark's unit, who gave me the piece that changed everything. I called her under the flimsy pretense of asking about a work schedule, and somewhere in the conversation she went quiet and then said, carefully, that there had been a count discrepancy flagged on his unit about 1.5 years earlier, that management had looked into it, that Mark had been well liked enough and the numbers close enough to explainable loss that it got chalked up to documentation errors and quietly closed. 1.5 years, not months. Not since Lily started noticing, since before that. The story I'd been telling myself, that this was something recent, something that had crept up on a tired, overworked man, dissolved right there on the phone, and what replaced it was much colder. People at his own job had already wondered, and decided it was easier to let it go. The next thing I found broke something in me that the pill bottle hadn't managed to. I was going through old pharmacy records online, trying to cross-reference dates, when I noticed a refill history on my own account from after Ben's birth. Oxycodone prescribed to me for the surgical recovery, 30 pills, refilled once. I remembered taking maybe 6 of them total because they made me sick. I went looking for the rest of that bottle in the back of our medicine cabinet where I'd left it, half full, meaning to throw it out eventually, the way you mean to do a lot of things after a newborn. It wasn't half full. It was empty, the label peeled at one corner like someone had worked at it with a thumbnail. He hadn't only been taking from strangers at work, he'd taken from me, while I was still sore and exhausted, and trusting him to hold our new baby steady, and some part of my own recovery had gone into keeping him functional. The scare with the kids happened on a Saturday I still can't think about without my chest going tight. I'd run to the store for 20 minutes, left him with both of them, and came home to find Ben, who was 7, standing at the top of the pool ladder in the backyard with his floaties on the wrong way, and Mark asleep sitting upright on a lawn chair 10 feet away. Not drunk looking, just gone. His head tipped back and his mouth open in a way I now recognized instead of explained away. Nothing happened. Ben climbed down on his own, bored of waiting, and went back to his tablet. But I stood in that yard doing the math on how close nothing had come to being something, and that was the day the question stopped being about my marriage and became about whether I could leave him alone with my own children. I packed a bag 2 nights later. I had it in the trunk, car keys in hand. Kids buckled in for what I told them was a sleepover at Grandma's, and I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes without starting the engine. I want to say some beautiful memory of him stopped me, and maybe some small ember of that did, but honestly what stopped me was colder and more practical than that. I didn't know yet what I was dealing with, how deep it went, whether leaving would save my kids from something, or just remove the one adult in the house who was still paying attention. I turned the car off and went back inside, and I told myself it was a delay, not a decision, though I understand now those two things aren't always as different as we want them to be. The gym bag had been sitting in our garage for months by the time I finally unzipped it. The one I'd told myself was for his new workout routine, under a folded, unused set of resistance bands, still with the tags on. There was enough to end a career, and probably start a criminal file. Loose pills in a repurposed vitamin bottle, 3 of the prepaid phones, a folded stack of paper with names and dosages and dates going back further than I wanted to count, and, tucked in a zippered pocket, a photo of the 2 of us from our wedding, creased soft from handling. I did the math on the earliest date on that paper. It went back before Ben was born. It went back, as close as I could figure, to almost the start of our marriage, to a back injury he'd had helping a patient transfer 2 months after our wedding, an injury I remembered clearly because I'd nursed him through it myself, brought him ice packs, felt so proud of how tough he was about the pain. I sat on the garage floor with a decade of my marriage rearranging itself in real time, understanding that the man I thought I'd known for 10 years had been managing this the entire time I knew him, and that whatever I thought that marriage had been, it had been that alongside something else the whole way through. He didn't fight me on it when I finally put everything on the table. The phones, the paper, the pool, my own emptied pill bottle. He put his head down on his arms at our kitchen table, and he cried in a way I'd never once seen him cry. Not at either birth, not at his father's funeral, and admitted all of it, the years of it, the fear of being caught, the fear of being fine. 3 weeks later, the hospital called our house directly, not for him, for me, informing me as his emergency contact that he'd been placed on administrative leave pending a state board investigation into missing controlled substances on his unit, that Renata's flag discrepancy from a 1.5 years back was being reopened alongside newer numbers, and that depending on what they found, he could lose his license and possibly face charges. It was no longer a secret we were keeping between us in a kitchen. It had a case number. I stayed. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it up, because I know how it sounds against everything that came before it. I stayed because the man who cried at that table was still somewhere underneath the 12 years of careful lying, and because our kids have a father who is trying now, in a treatment program with actual accountability, instead of a colleague named Denny, in a way he was never trying before Lily said one sentence in a bathtub that she has since completely forgotten. I stayed watching him white-knuckle it through the first 30 days, watching him relapse once in week 6 and tell me himself instead of hiding it, which somehow mattered more to me than if it hadn't happened at all. I still check his gym bag sometimes. I'm not embarrassed about that anymore. I still notice when he's quiet after a long shift, and my stomach still drops before my brain catches up and reminds me he's not on shift anymore. He's on leave. He's in a program. He is, as of this morning, 11 months clean. I don't know how the story ends. Nobody does with this kind of thing, no matter what the recovery pamphlets promise you. But I know what a 4-year-old sentence in a bathtub gave me, which was 10 years of looking away handed back to me all at once, and the chance, however uncertain, to finally look straight at it instead. For 7 years, I thought I had a pretty good handle on the shape of my own life. Married to Mark, 1 kid, a house in the kind of neighborhood where everyone edges their lawn on the same Saturday schedule, and a husband who left every morning at 7:40 in a shirt he'd ironed himself, headed downtown to Bramwell Consulting, where he had, as he liked to mention at dinner parties, finally landed a corner office. I believe that sentence the way you believe the sun's going to come up. I never once thought to check it. It was a Tuesday when I decided to surprise him for lunch. Nothing special about the day, that's what still gets me. I wasn't suspicious of anything. I just missed him, and I had an extra hour, and I thought it would be sweet to show up with sandwiches. So I called the front desk to ask which conference room he'd be in, and a very polite young woman put me on hold, came back, and told me there was no one by that name currently employed there. I laughed. I actually laughed. Told her she must be new. Gave her his full name again. Spelled the last name. She checked again and said, gently, like she felt bad for me, that according to their system, he hadn't been on staff in about 2 years. I told her that had to be a mistake, and hung up before she could say anything else, because some part of me needed to hang up before the sentence finished landing. I called back an hour later and asked for HR directly, said I was doing paperwork for a mortgage refinance, and needed to confirm his employment dates. That's the version of myself I don't love thinking about. The one who lied smoothly on the spot to get information about her own husband. The woman in HR was kind and businesslike, and told me his last day had been in March, 2 years prior. She even gave me the exact date. I wrote it on the back of a receipt with a shaking hand, and then sat in my car in the Trader Joe's parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to make the math make sense, because 2 years is not a small number. 2 years is 700 mornings of him putting on a tie. For about a week, I didn't say anything to him. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part that embarrasses me most now. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe he'd switched firms and never updated me. Maybe there was a Bramwell in another city. Maybe I'd misheard him years ago and he actually worked somewhere else this whole time, and I'd just been saying the wrong name at parties like an idiot. I needed there to be a boring explanation, because the alternative didn't fit in my head yet. So instead of asking him, I started looking, quietly. At night, after he was asleep, I went through the file box in the office closet, where we kept old statements. That's where I found the first real crack. A credit card I didn't recognize, opened in his name only, with a balance that made my stomach drop. 4 figures, then 5. Cash advances, a lot of them, timed for late morning. 11:30, which made no sense for a man supposedly sitting in a corner office with meetings back to back. You don't take out cash advances during your 10 a.m. sync. A few nights later, I found the second thing, a receipt for a storage unit, autopay, $42 a month. A facility about 15 minutes from the house. I had literally never heard him mention. I didn't know what was in it. For one bad night, I let myself imagine everything. Another woman, another family, a whole second life with its own furniture. It ended up being none of that, but I didn't know that yet, and the not knowing was its own kind of sick. The next piece came from somewhere I didn't expect at all. I ran into a woman named Priya at the grocery store, someone Mark used to work with, and she lit up when she saw me, gave me a hug, asked how he was doing. Then she said, completely casually, like she was commenting on the weather, that it had been a while since anyone had seen him around. Tell him the old crew says hi. It was the word "a while" that got me. Not 2 years, just a while. Said the way you'd say it about someone who'd switched buildings, not someone who'd vanished. Which meant this hadn't been some sudden secret he was scrambling to protect. It had settled. It had become normal to everyone around it except me. That's when I stopped waiting for an explanation to fall into my lap, and decided to go get one myself. The next morning, after he kissed me goodbye and backed the car out at his usual time, I got in mine and followed him, staying 2 cars back the way you see people do in movies, feeling ridiculous and furious in equal measure. He didn't drive downtown. He drove 11 minutes to the public library, parked in the same spot, I'd guess, that he parked in every day, and walked in carrying his laptop bag like he was walking into an office. I sat outside for a minute, deciding what to do, then went in after him, and found him at a table by the windows in the business section. Tie still nodded, laptop open, looking for all the world like a man deep in spreadsheets. I stood there for a second, just watching him from behind a shelf of books on tax law, and it hit me that I was looking at where my husband had spent roughly 500 weekdays of our marriage. What I didn't expect was that he wasn't alone in it. Over the next few days, without him knowing, I went back at different times and started noticing a pattern. 3 or 4 other men, all around his age, all dressed like they had somewhere important to be, rotating in and out of that same section like it was their office. They knew each other. They nodded at each other. One time I saw one of them cover for another guy on a phone call, saying, "Yeah, he just stepped into a meeting. Can I take a message?" in the exact tone you'd use for a real coworker. There was an entire unspoken arrangement among men who were all doing the same thing, all maintaining each other's alibi without ever having to say out loud what they were doing, because they all already knew. I still hadn't confronted him. I told myself I wanted the full picture before I did. But really, I think I was scared of what would happen once I said it out loud, and couldn't take it back. So I kept digging. And that's when I found out why he'd actually left Bramwell. Because it wasn't the layoffs I'd assumed, the kind everyone was quietly whispering about back then. I got an old coworker of his on the phone, someone I barely knew, and asked her straight out, and after a long pause, she told me he'd been let go for cause, that he'd padded expense reports for over a year before anyone caught it, hotel charges for trips he never took, client dinners that never happened. It wasn't dramatic, nothing criminal enough for handcuffs, just enough for a quiet firing and a signed agreement that nobody would talk about the details, which meant the lie hadn't started with the fake job. The fake job was just what he built on top of an earlier lie, like he'd never actually learned a different way to handle a problem. The money question kept nagging at me, because a library doesn't cost anything, and a man still has to eat and put gas in his car and, apparently, feed a storage unit $42 a month. So I called his mother, gently, under the excuse of asking about a family recipe, and worked the conversation around to how proud they must be of him doing so well. She got warm, and said something that stopped me cold, that they were so glad they could help him get that little side investment off the ground, and hoped it paid off soon. I asked how much, trying to sound casual, and she named a number that made me sit down. $18,000, wired to him over the past year, for a business venture that as far as I could tell existed nowhere, except in whatever he'd told her. The last piece, the one that finally moved me from investigating to acting, was the home equity paperwork I found buried in that storage unit, in a folder with my name typed on the signature line, in a way that wasn't quite my handwriting, and wasn't quite not. $41,000 pulled against the house. Next to it, a closed account statement for our son's savings, the one we'd started the day he was born, zeroed out 8 months earlier. I sat on the concrete floor of that unit with a flashlight and read every page twice, because I needed to be completely sure before I let myself feel what I was starting to feel, which was less like sadness and more like the floor tilting under a building I'd trusted for 7 years. The next morning I didn't say a word. I watched him get up at his normal time, watched him iron the same shirt, watched him knot his tie in the mirror with the exact same care he'd been giving it for 2 years straight, like the ritual itself was the job. He kissed me on the cheek, told me he had a big presentation, and said he'd probably be a little late. I told him to have a good day. I meant it, in a way, because I wanted him to have exactly the day he'd built for himself. I gave him a 20-minute head start and drove to the library. He was right where I expected, tie still perfect, laptop open to nothing in particular. I sat down across from him and set the folder from the storage unit on the table between us, my name misspelled on the copy of my own signature. I asked him, quietly enough not to disturb anyone else in the business section, whether the presentation was going well. He looked at the folder, then at me, and the color just left his face. And for a second, neither of us said anything, and one of the other men 2 tables over glanced up, then very deliberately looked back down at his own screen, because he understood exactly what was happening better than I did. I moved out 6 weeks later. Not right away, because there was a kid involved and a house, and a lot of very unglamorous logistics. But the decision itself took about 4 seconds, sitting in that library. What surprises me now, looking back, is how little of it feels tragic. It should, probably. There's a version of this where I'm still crying about it. Instead, what I mostly remember is the absurdity, the sheer scale of effort it must have taken. 2 years of ironed shirts and packed lunches, and a fake commute, and a rotating cast of men covering for each other's meetings, all to avoid one conversation that would have taken maybe 20 minutes and hurt a fraction as much as any of this did. He could have just told me he got fired. I would have been upset, and then we would have figured it out together, the way you do. Instead, he built an entire second job whose only output was maintaining a lie. And somehow that job was the one thing he showed up for every single day without fail. Best attendance record of his career, and it was for a position that didn't exist. After 9 years of marriage, 4 of them spent trying for a baby, I found the receipt for his vasectomy folded up small in the pocket of a canvas jacket I was about to drop into a garbage bag for the church donation bin. It was a gray Sunday in October, the kind where the light comes through the blinds looking tired before noon even hits. And I was finally doing the thing I'd been putting off for 2 years, which was clearing out the coats we never wore anymore. He'd worn that jacket for yard work back when we first bought the house, before he switched to the newer one his mother got him for Christmas. I almost didn't check the pockets. I almost just balled it up and stuffed it in with the rest. But something made me pat it down first, an old habit from finding forgotten $20 bills, and that's when the paper crackled against my fingers. It wasn't a receipt from a place I recognized. Not our family doctor, not the pharmacy in town, not the clinic where we'd spent 4 years sitting in waiting rooms with pastel walls and outdated parenting magazines. It was a name I'd never heard him say once in 9 years. Some men's health center 2 counties over, and a date printed at the top that didn't match up with anything I could remember him ever telling me about. No surgery, no procedure, nothing. I sat down on the edge of the bed with that little slip of paper and read the line under the clinic's name, twice before it actually landed. Procedure, vasectomy. I remember laughing, actually laughing. A short, confused sound, because my first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Some old receipt from before he even owned the coat. Maybe his father's. Maybe a stranger's coat that got mixed up at a dry cleaner years back. But his name was right there, printed clean under a line for insurance, spelled the exact way it's spelled on our joint tax return. I did the math before I even decided to. The date on that receipt put it 11 years back, 3 weeks to be exact before our wedding day. I didn't say anything to him that night. I told myself I needed to understand it first, because there was a version of this where it made sense, where maybe something had gone wrong with a reversal, and he'd never told me, because he didn't want to get my hopes up over something that failed anyway. And men do strange, quiet things with shame sometimes, I know that. So the next morning, after he left for the middle school where he's taught 7th grade science for going on 14 years, I called the clinic myself. I told the woman who answered that I was updating our insurance records and needed his file sent over. She was kind, unhurried, the kind of small-town friendly, where you can hear her smiling through the phone. And she pulled it up without any hesitation at all. "Of course," she said. "We'll send everything, including his follow-ups. He's been very consistent about those, bless him." I asked her, careful not to let my voice shake, what she meant by follow-ups. "His annual check," she said, "just to confirm everything's still holding. Some men skip it, but he never has. Very responsible." I asked when the most recent one was, and she told me a date from 3 years back, and I felt my stomach drop somewhere below the floor of that kitchen, because I knew that date. I knew it the way you know your own name. That was the week we sat in Dr. Aldana's office and heard the words unexplained secondary infertility for the first time. The week she suggested we move forward with IUI. The week my husband held my hand in the parking lot afterward and told me we'd figure this out together, that we weren't going to let this beat us. He had gone to confirm he was still sterile the same week he sat beside me while a doctor tried to explain why my body wasn't cooperating with a man who had made sure, on purpose, years earlier, that it never would. I didn't confront him yet. I know that probably sounds strange, but grief does something to your hands before it gets to your mouth. And mine wanted proof before words. I dug out my old planners from the hall closet, the paper ones I've kept every year since we got married, because I like being able to flip back and remember things. I lined up every date I could find from that clinic, against every excuse he'd ever given me for being somewhere else. A faculty training day. A dentist appointment, he said, was for a cracked filling. A staff development conference 2 towns over that I remembered him coming home from smelling like a different soap than the one we kept in our own shower. 4 times. At least 4 times I could pin down exactly. His lie and his follow-up lined up on the same day. And then, because I was already unraveling and couldn't stop pulling the thread, I went looking through an old email account of his accost. I still had the password to from years back, before we switched providers, back when we used to share one computer. I wasn't proud of it. I found an exchange with his younger brother from around the time of our wedding, short and careful, the way men write when they're avoiding a thing. His brother had written, "Does she still not know? You're really going to marry her without telling her?" And my husband had written back, "It's not the right time. I'll tell her eventually. Drop it." Eventually turned into 11 years. I confronted him that night, the receipt on the kitchen table between us like something that could still bite. He didn't argue, didn't deny it, didn't even really look surprised that I'd found out. More like a man who'd been waiting years for a door to finally open on its own. He told me it wasn't about not wanting a family with me. He said it was about his own father, a man who drank through most of my husband's childhood, and left holes in him he didn't think he could trust himself not to pass down. He said he'd meant to tell me before the wedding, then kept meaning to. Then it became something he couldn't find a doorway back into without losing me. So he just let the silence keep building walls until the walls were the whole house. I asked him about the sperm analysis. The 2 times over the years we'd sat in that clinic and been told his numbers needed to be redone. Contaminated sample, lab error, count too low to read properly. I asked him how many times he'd actually let them test him for real. He was quiet a long moment before he told me the truth, which was almost never, that he'd found ways to stall it, to make it look like bad luck instead of biology, because a clean test would have ended the whole story on the spot. That's when it hit me, the way it should have hit me from the very start, standing in my own kitchen with a slip of paper 11 years old. Every single time I cried in a clinic parking lot, and there were more of those afternoons than I can count on both hands. Every time I sat gripping the steering wheel while he rubbed slow circles on my back and told me we'd get through this. He had one sentence sitting right behind his teeth that could have ended all of it. "I can't have children. I made sure of that before we got married." 9 words. He had 4 years of parking lots to say them, and he chose, every single time, to hold me instead, and let me keep believing my own body was the thing failing us. A week later, looking for tax documents on his laptop, I found something else. A note he'd started typing to me almost 2 years back. A draft never sent. An apology that got as far as 3 sentences before it just stopped. Like he'd looked at what he'd written and lost his nerve, and tucked in a drawer of his classroom desk. When I dropped by the school one afternoon to bring him something, and ended up waiting alone in his empty room, I found a folder of pamphlets from an adoption agency 2 hours away, and a printed page about sperm donor programs, dated only a few months back. Like some part of him had been quietly trying to build us a way out of a hole only he knew he'd dug, without ever having to say out loud how it got there. I didn't leave because he didn't want children. People are allowed not to want that, and if he'd told me the truth before I put on a white dress in front of everyone we'd ever known, I like to think I would have found a way to sit with that, to grieve the family I wouldn't have and still choose him anyway. Or not choose him, but at least choose with my eyes open. What I couldn't sit with was the theft of that choice. 4 years of my body being blamed in exam rooms, 4 years of hormone shots and ultrasounds, and a grief I carried thinking it was mine alone to carry, when the whole time it had an author, and that author held my hand through every bit of it and said nothing. I packed my things over the course of about 3 weeks. Slow. The way you do things when part of you is still hoping someone will say the sentence that fixes it. even though you already know no sentence can reach back far enough. Word got around town fast, the way it does in a place small enough that the woman at the clinic probably knew before some of my own family did. I moved into my sister's spare room on the edge of town, close enough to still see the school parking lot from the road sometimes when I drive past. I don't hate him, not most days. I just carry a kind of grief that doesn't have a clean shape to it. Grief for years I can't get handed back. For a version of myself who sat in waiting rooms hoping, who thanked God for a husband so patient with her broken body, when there was nothing broken in me at all. That's the part that stays with me longest, quieter than anger, heavier than it looks from the outside. Some things, once they're taken from you, there's no receipt long enough to prove what they were worth. 15 years of marriage teaches you the sound of a house when your husband is in it. You learn the specific creak of his office chair, the rhythm of his typing when he's deep in a ticket, the exact volume of the television when he's actually watching it, versus when he's just letting it run while he scrolls on his phone. I knew Mark's sounds the way you know your own heartbeat, which is to say I didn't think about them at all until the night my phone told me to follow someone I'd never heard of. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. Both kids gone now. One in Denver and one in a graduate program in Boston. The house quieter than it's been in 20 years. I was lying in bed scrolling before sleep, the way you do, thumb moving without much thought. An Instagram suggestion bar slid a new face across my screen. Accounts you might like. A username I didn't recognize. Some combination of a word and numbers. The kind of handle a teenager picks and never changes. The profile photo wasn't even a face. It was a mug of coffee sitting on a windowsill. Morning light coming through in that flat gray way it does in our kitchen in November. I almost scrolled past it. That's the part that still gets me. Months later, how close I came to just swiping up and going to sleep. But something about the angle of that windowsill snagged on the back of my mind, the way a splinter does before you've even registered the pain. And I tapped it. The account had 400 followers, 412 posts, a bio that just said, trying to figure it out, one day at a time. Nothing about a name, a job, a location. I scrolled through the grid on autopilot at first. Coffee mugs, a bike on a trail I didn't recognize, a plate of eggs, the ordinary visual diary of somebody's ordinary life. And I was already thinking about closing the app when I saw the desk. It was our desk. The one in the spare room we call an office. The one Mark sits at 8 hours a day doing remote support for a logistics company. The same monitor. The same little potted succulent I bought at a farmer's market 2 summers ago. Sitting in the exact same corner. The photo was cropped so you couldn't see who was sitting there. Just a forearm. A wrist. The edge of a flannel sleeve I could have picked out of a lineup blindfolded. I sat up in bed. My first thought. The stupid, generous thought a wife has before her brain catches up to her gut. Was that someone had hacked our Wi-Fi, or that a friend had been in our house and taken a picture I didn't remember. I kept scrolling, faster now, and the captions started doing something to me that the photos hadn't. They were short, a sentence or two under each image, and buried in the third one down I read the phrase, "Some days you just gotta ride it out." And I heard it, not rate it. Heard it, in his voice, the exact cadence he uses when he's trying to end a conversation about something that's bothering him, the same 4 words he'd said to me, not 2 weeks earlier, when I asked if his back was still hurting. I want to be honest about what happened in my chest at that moment, because I think people imagine there's a scream, a slammed laptop, something cinematic. There wasn't. There was just a kind of drop, the floor of my stomach giving out quiet and total. The way it does on a plane when the pilot says nothing over the speaker, but the whole cabin still feels it. I kept going, because I couldn't not. I went back through the grid, month by month, and the dates stopped me cold. This wasn't new. The oldest post I could find, scrolling until my thumb ached, was from 6 years ago. 6 years of mugs and bike trails and half-lit selfies of a jaw I recognized and a mouth I'd kissed 1,000 times. Turned just enough away from the camera that no algorithm and no stranger scrolling past would ever think twice. 6 years of a person living somewhere I had never been invited. I told myself I'd stop looking. I did not stop looking. I went into the comments, and that's where I found her. A woman sunlit mornings who'd left comments on probably 200 of his posts going back years, and he'd answered nearly all of them. And somewhere around post 90, I found a comment from her that said, "Call me tonight when she's asleep." And my hand went cold holding the phone, because she had a face now, and it was mine, 3 feet away in my own bed, while my husband apparently sat wide awake in some other version of his life. What unsettled me most wasn't even the affair, if that's what it was. It was who he was being. This man in the captions had opinions. He argued, gently, in the comments, about politics, about music, in a voice that was quick and a little cocky, and funny, in a way that Mark, my Mark, hadn't been funny in front of me in years. This account laughed at itself. It flirted. It disagreed with people and didn't apologize for it. I had spent 15 years married to a man everyone, myself included, described with the word steady, which is a word you use for a person you've stopped being curious about. And here was proof that the curiosity had simply gone somewhere else. Then I found the video, and that undid the last thread of doubt I was still, pathetically, holding on to. It was a reel, 15 seconds, him laughing at something off camera, and the sound was on, and it was his laugh, unmistakably, the real one. The one I hadn't heard directed at me since maybe our 10th anniversary. Hearing it come out of a stranger's video at 11:40 at night while he slept down the hall was worse than any photograph could have been. A photo you can rationalize, a laugh you can't. I almost stopped there. I told myself I had enough, that this was already more than any person should have to carry alone into a Wednesday morning. But my thumb kept moving, and a caption date caught my eye because I recognized it, and I felt the whole night rearrange itself around me a second time. It was the date of my father's funeral. I remembered that week in fragments. The casseroles, the folding chairs, Mark's hand on my back in the receiving line, and Mark telling me around 10 that night that he needed 20 minutes to deal with a work emergency, a server down somewhere in Ohio, and stepping out to the car. The post was time-stamped 9:52 p.m., a photo of a parking lot at dusk, captioned, "Sometimes you need air more than you need answers." I sat with that for a long time. I had grieved my father with a man who was narrating his own inner life to 400 strangers, instead of to me. In the same 20 minutes he told me he was rescuing a server. I thought about calling my sister. I got as far as opening our text thread and typing, "You're not going to believe this," before I deleted it. Because some instinct told me that once I said it out loud to someone else, it would become a story with a shape. A story other people would have opinions about, and I wasn't ready to hand it over yet. I thought about messaging Sunlit Mornings directly, asking her who she thought she'd been talking to for 6 years, and I actually typed 3 different versions of that message and deleted every one, because I realized I was less angry at her than I was terrified of what her answer would tell me about my own house. So I put the phone face down on the nightstand a little after midnight, and I did not sleep. And in the morning, I did not say anything, because I wanted to see him first, not confront him, see him. I wanted to sit across a table from my husband and watch for the seams. I made dinner that night the way I always do on Wednesdays, and he came in from the office at 6:30, smelling like the same soap, wearing the same flannel from the photo. And for a moment, while he set the table, I almost convinced myself the whole previous night had been some fever, some algorithm error, until he laughed at something on his phone, and it was that laugh, the real laugh, right there over the pasta, aimed at nothing, at some private joke on a screen I couldn't see. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. He didn't notice. I asked him, casual as I could make it, how work had been that day, and he said fine, quiet, nothing much going on. And I said, "You seemed like you were in a good mood earlier," testing the smallest possible edge of a question, watching his face, the way you watch weather come in over a field. Something crossed it. Not guilt exactly, more like the flicker of a man checking whether a door he thought was closed had actually been closed. And he said, "Yeah, I don't know. Good day, I guess," and reached for the pepper, and his hand was not quite steady on the grinder, and I noticed that, and he noticed me noticing, and neither of us said one true word to the other for the rest of the meal. It was near the end of dinner, clearing plates, that the last piece landed, the one I still can't fully sit still with. I'd left my own phone on the counter, and out of habit more than suspicion at that point, I opened Instagram again, just to look one more time at that account before I put it away for good. And I saw, in the small gray text under the follow button, a note I hadn't clicked into before, followed by, and my own name was on the list. Not my real account, but a second small icon next to it. One I didn't recognize. A blank gray silhouette with no posts, no followers. Created, according to the join date on its bare little profile, 4 years ago. I clicked it out of some numb reflex, and it followed nothing else. No public posts. Just a following list, hidden, private, that consisted of exactly one account. Mine. My real one. He, or whoever this ghost profile belonged to, had been watching my life scroll by for 4 years. Every photo I posted of the garden, of the kids, of us, silently, from a name that wasn't his, and wasn't anyone's, sitting 3 feet from me at dinner while I asked him about his day. I haven't told him what I found, not the account, not the woman, not the funeral post, not the silent profile that's been watching me back. I don't know yet what I'm going to do with any of it, and some nights, I think I know exactly what I'll say to him, and other nights, I can't imagine opening my mouth at all. He hasn't brought it up either, which means he either doesn't know I've seen it, or he does, and is waiting the way I'm waiting, both of us circling the same silence from opposite sides of the same bed. And some nights I lie there and listen to him breathing next to me, and I genuinely could not tell you, not for certain, which one of us I'm actually lying beside.